In December 1944, as snow swallowed the forests of the Ardennes and the cold hardened men into brittle shadows of themselves, German commanders believed they had found their moment. The Western Front, they thought, was tired, thin, and complacent. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive, was meant to split the Allied lines, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. Yet in the middle of this gamble stood a small Belgian town whose name would soon echo through German field reports with an uneasy edge: Bastogne. To German soldiers advancing through the frozen woods, Bastogne was supposed to fall quickly. It was a road hub. 7 major roads converged there, and its capture would grease the gears of the offensive. But on December 18th, something unexpected happened. American paratroopers, many of them rushed straight from rest camps in France, began pouring into the town. They came by truck, without winter clothing, often without proper ammunition. Their unit patches showed a screaming eagle clutching a dagger. They were the 101st Airborne Division. German veterans noticed them immediately. These were not ordinary infantry. They did not dig in like men expecting rescue. They moved fast, argued loudly, laughed in the snow, and took positions as if they intended to stay forever. One German grenadier later wrote in his diary that the Americans at Bastogne behaved like hunters, not hunted men. This attitude alone planted the first seed of fear. As German armor closed in, the ring tightened. By December 21st, Bastogne was completely surrounded. German artillery pounded the town relentlessly. Snow fell through the smoke, muffling screams and explosions alike. Any reasonable soldier might have expected surrender. Supplies were critically low. Medics had no morphine. Ammunition was rationed to the bullet. And yet, the 101st showed no sign of collapse. German patrols probing the American lines reported something disturbing. Every attack was met with violent counterfire, even at night, even in blizzards. Paratroopers ambushed German squads from foxholes barely visible beneath snowdrifts. Machine guns were shifted constantly, giving the illusion of far greater numbers. When German infantry tried to infiltrate through the forests, they were hunted aggressively, sometimes stalked for hours. Then came the moment that spread through German units like a dark joke. On December 22nd, German officers entered Bastogne under a white flag and delivered a formal surrender demand. The American reply, later relayed through the lines, was a single word: nuts. To the Germans, this was more than defiance. It was madness. Men who should have been freezing, starving, and broken were mocking them. From that point on, fear took a new shape. German soldiers no longer saw Bastogne as a trapped enemy. They saw it as a fortress filled with men who refused to behave logically. Veterans of the Eastern Front admitted that the Americans here reminded them uncomfortably of Soviet defenders, unyielding, stubborn, and willing to die where they stood. As the siege dragged on, one truth became clear to those attacking Bastogne. The screaming eagles were not just holding ground, they were breaking morale. And this was only the beginning. As the siege of Bastogne deepened, German infantry units began to realize that fighting the 101st Airborne was unlike facing any American force they had met before. These men did not fight defensively in the traditional sense. Instead of simply clinging to foxholes and waiting for relief, the Screaming Eagles behaved as if they controlled the battlefield, even while surrounded. German after-action reports from late December 1944 repeatedly mention a strange and unsettling pattern. American positions would fall silent after bombardment, only to erupt moments later with renewed ferocity. Artillery would smash suspected foxholes, trees would splinter, and snow would turn black with earth. German soldiers advanced expecting broken resistance. Instead, they were met by sudden, accurate machine gun fire and rifle volleys at point-blank range. To many Germans, it felt as though the Americans refused to stay dead. Patrols sent to probe the American perimeter often vanished into the woods. Survivors described being stalked by unseen enemies who used the forest as if it were their natural habitat. Paratroopers moved quietly through the snow, wearing improvised white camouflage made from bedsheets and parachute fabric. They set up small ambush teams, 3 or 4 men at most, who struck quickly and disappeared before artillery could be called in. German soldiers, used to more rigid American tactics earlier in the war, found this behavior deeply unnerving. What frightened them even more was the aggression. Even at night, even in freezing fog, the 101st launched limited counterattacks. These were not large assaults meant to retake territory, but sharp, sudden thrusts designed to kill, confuse, and withdraw. A German corporal later recalled that the Americans attacked us as if they were the ones encircling us. This psychological reversal, being hunted while supposedly on the offensive, eroded confidence across entire companies. German medics and rear echelon troops were not spared. Paratroopers targeted supply runners, mortar teams, and communication lines. Wires were cut. Messengers disappeared. Rumors spread that the Americans were deliberately aiming to isolate units and let fear do the rest. Whether true or not, the effect was devastating. Soldiers began bunching together for safety, making them easier targets for artillery and machine guns. Perhaps most alarming was the discipline under fire. Even when low on ammunition, the 101st rarely wasted shots. German officers noted the precision of American small arms fire, especially from veteran non-commissioned officers. Each attack felt deliberate, controlled, and confident, qualities that suggested experience far beyond what the Germans expected from airborne troops who had been dropped into battle with minimal preparation. By late December, the reputation of the Screaming Eagles had grown darker in German ranks. They were no longer seen as ordinary Americans. They were described as fanatical, unbreakable, and dangerously unpredictable. For soldiers advancing through the frozen woods toward Bastogne, fear no longer came only from the cold or Allied artillery. It came from the knowledge that somewhere ahead, unseen and waiting, the men of the 101st Airborne were watching, and they were ready to strike again. By the 3rd week of December, 1944, the battle for Bastogne had become a test not just of weapons, but of endurance. Temperatures plunged well below freezing. Snow covered the ground in thick, uneven layers, and icy winds cut through uniforms like knives. German soldiers suffered terribly in the cold. But what disturbed them most was discovering that the men of the 101st Airborne were enduring the same conditions and still refusing to break. Inside Bastogne, the situation for the Americans was desperate. Food was scarce, ammunition was rationed, medical supplies were almost gone. Wounded men lay in cellars and aid stations with no heat, no proper bandages, and little hope of evacuation. German artillery struck churches, homes, and field hospitals alike. From a purely military perspective, German officers believed the Americans had to surrender. No unit could survive like this for long. Yet every day, German attacks were met with stubborn resistance. German infantry, advancing toward American lines, often noticed something deeply unsettling. Wounded paratroopers were still fighting. Men with frost-bitten hands continued to load rifles. Soldiers who should have been evacuated refused to leave their positions. In several captured German reports, there are mentions of Americans firing from snow-covered holes while clearly injured. To exhausted German troops, this seemed almost inhuman. The cold itself became a weapon, used differently by each side. German units, many of them already weakened by earlier fighting, struggled with frozen weapons, stiff fingers, and failing morale. The 101st Airborne, trained for extreme conditions and improvisation, adapted faster. They wrapped rags around metal parts of rifles, rotated sentries frequently, and shared every scrap of warmth. More importantly, they shared a belief that giving up was not an option. German soldiers began to whisper that the Americans were driven by something beyond orders. Bastogne was not just a tactical objective to the 101st, it was a matter of pride. The Screaming Eagles had jumped into Normandy, fought in Holland, and now found themselves surrounded in the dead of winter. Surrender would erase their identity. Holding Bastogne defined who they were. This mindset terrified the Germans. In one documented engagement, German troops overran a forward American position, only to be counterattacked hours later by paratroopers emerging from the darkness and snow. Some of these men had been presumed dead earlier in the day. To the Germans, it felt as though the battlefield itself was betraying them, giving life back to an enemy that refused to disappear. Even prisoners taken from the 101st displayed an unusual calm. German interrogators reported that these Americans were confident, almost dismissive of their situation. They spoke openly about relief forces coming, about holding as long as it takes. Whether they truly knew help was coming or not mattered little. Their certainty infected those listening. By this stage of the siege, fear had fully taken root. German soldiers no longer asked if Bastogne would fall, but how much it would cost. Every frozen field, every dark tree line, every ruined house seemed to hide men who felt no pain, no fear, and no doubt. The Screaming Eagles were still surrounded, but in the minds of many German troops, it was becoming increasingly unclear who was truly trapped. Oh, as Christmas approached, German commanders grew increasingly frustrated. Bastogne was supposed to be a brief obstacle, a speed bump on the road to Antwerp. Instead, it had become a wound that refused to close, bleeding time, men, fuel, and morale. And at the center of that wound stood the 101st Airborne, quietly dismantling the German offensive from the inside. German units tasked with capturing Bastogne were elite formations themselves: Volksgrenadiers, Panzer-Lehr elements, and battle-hardened infantry. Yet their momentum slowed to a crawl. Attacks that should have overwhelmed a surrounded enemy stalled again and again. Each failed assault deepened a sense of dread among the soldiers ordered forward. They began to associate the name Bastogne not with victory, but with pointless loss. One reason was the Americans' mastery of terrain. The 101st Airborne turned every hedgerow, farmhouse, and frozen ditch into a killing zone. German soldiers reported that the Americans seemed to know the ground better than they did, despite arriving only days earlier. Paratroopers shifted positions constantly, firing from one location and then reappearing somewhere else. To German attackers, it felt like fighting shadows. Communication failures worsened the fear. American artillery observers, often positioned in church towers or hidden tree lines, directed devastatingly accurate fire onto German assembly areas. Entire units were caught forming up for attacks and shattered before they could even move. German soldiers began to dread daylight, knowing that any visible movement could draw sudden destruction. Psychologically, the 101st inflicted damage far beyond their numbers. German officers struggled to motivate men who had already assaulted Bastogne multiple times, with nothing to show for it. Soldiers whispered that the Americans were immune to fear, that they had nothing left to lose, and were therefore the most dangerous kind of enemy. Some compared them to cornered animals, others to fanatics. The failure to capture Bastogne also created chaos at higher levels of command. German supply columns were forced to detour around the town, exposing them to air attack once the weather cleared. Fuel shortages worsened. Timetables collapsed. The longer the Screaming Eagles held, the more the entire Ardennes plan unraveled. Then came the sound that German soldiers had been dreading: Allied aircraft engines overhead. As the skies cleared, American planes dropped supplies into Bastogne, parachutes blooming white against the snow. For the Germans watching from the woods, this was a crushing blow. The surrounded enemy was no longer starving. Hope surged through American lines, while German morale sank further. Worst of all, the Germans knew what came next. If Bastogne held long enough, Allied armor would break through. And when that happened, the men who had resisted in the snow would not merely defend, they would strike back. By Christmas Day, many German soldiers no longer believed in the offensive. They believed only in survival. Bastogne had become a symbol of everything going wrong, and the 101st Airborne its living embodiment. Fear now shaped every German decision around the town. Orders were followed slowly. Attacks lacked conviction. The Screaming Eagles had not just stopped the Germans, they had hollowed out the will to continue. And somewhere beyond the frozen horizon, American tanks were already moving closer. When American armor finally broke through to Bastogne on December 26, 1944, the German siege did not end with a dramatic collapse. Instead, it dissolved into something quieter and more telling: withdrawal. German units pulled back not because they had been annihilated, but because they no longer believed victory was possible there. The town had become cursed ground, and the men who had defended it, the 101st Airborne, had carved their reputation deep into German memory. German soldiers retreating from the Bastogne sector carried more than frostbite and exhaustion with them. They carried stories. Stories of Americans who fought while surrounded, of paratroopers who counterattacked in blizzards, of wounded men who refused to surrender. These accounts spread quickly through the ranks, growing darker with each retelling. Long after the battle, German veterans would recall Bastogne as a place where logic failed and morale died. What made the Screaming Eagles so frightening was not superior numbers or overwhelming firepower. It was their mindset. German officers understood this all too well. They noted that the 101st had been cut off, outgunned, and outsupplied, yet never acted like defeated men. Instead, they behaved as if the situation empowered them. Surrounded troops usually crumble. At Bastogne, they hardened. The famous reply, "Nuts," became more than a defiant message. To German ears, it symbolized an enemy who could not be intimidated. Psychological warfare relies on fear, exhaustion, and inevitability. The 101st rejected all three. Their refusal to surrender forced the Germans to question their own assumptions about American soldiers, who had often been dismissed earlier in the war as material-rich but mentally soft. After the war, German memoirs and interviews repeatedly returned to Bastogne. Veterans spoke of the Americans there with a tone usually reserved for elite or feared enemies. Some admitted that they would rather face a better-equipped unit elsewhere than return to those frozen woods. The Screaming Eagles had earned a reputation that outlived the battle itself. For the 101st Airborne, Bastogne became a defining moment, a symbol of endurance under impossible conditions. For the Germans, it became a warning etched into experience. Never underestimate an enemy who refuses to behave as expected. Bastogne did not just stop an offensive. It shattered confidence, drained momentum, and exposed the fragile psychology of an army already stretched to its limits. The Screaming Eagles stood at the center of that collapse, silent, frozen, and unyielding. And that is why, even decades later, German soldiers remembered Bastogne not as a defeat by tanks or planes, but as a battle lost to the will of men who simply would not give in. Stop, period. And that is ...